Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Bob Lam. I'm the CEO and co-founder of ShardSecure. We are a software company with a software that can enhance data security, privacy, and resiliency in a hybrid cloud, multi-cloud environment. Thank you for joining us today. Our webinar topic is data protection, resilience, and risk management in the cloud. Very pleased today, we have a very special guest who is also an advisor of the company, Marios, to share with us his many years of experience, leadership experience in this topic. Marios, thank you for joining us. If you could introduce yourself.
Happy to, Bob. Good to see you and delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate our collaboration. Look forward to chatting through some of the benefits, risks that we see out there and share that with our participants. Hi, everybody. Marios Damianides. I'm the Chief IT Risk Officer for Omnicom Group, based out of New York, a global conglomerate, media advertising holding company. Previously, I was partner at Ernst & Young for many years, over 30 years, before moving to Omnicom last year, in fact. My experiences vary in the security space in all aspects in terms of implementation, management. Cloud is one part of it, securing data, of course, privacy, all the elements that we think about when we think about resiliency and protection of important information. And looking forward to having a chat around that and answering some questions and just sharing part of the collaboration that is really important in our profession and in protecting data and in protecting people's personal information. Bob.
Okay, well, we have 30 minutes, so let's go straight into this. So first of all, Marios, last 2-3 years, the pandemics certainly has accelerated the adoption of the cloud among both large and small companies. Like, what are the benefits, right? The most obvious one, maybe you can save money, although we're hearing more and more complaints about companies about how expensive it is to use cloud providers now. And so, okay, let's say you save some money, cost saving, improve productivity. Can you discuss some other benefits to have your workloads and the data in the cloud?
Yeah. I think there's been a fair level of acceleration during the pandemic in terms of cloud. When we think about benefits, it certainly varies between size of organization, size of the adoption of the cloud, whether it's a more comprehensive, holistic, or part of the environment. Of course, each company needs to look at the total cost of ownership, TCO, of using cloud. Are they getting economies of scale? Are they trying to grow, and therefore is it a more cost-effective method for them to grow through use of cloud and using that versus purchasing, managing, and setting up? Certainly, there's economies of scale. The cost factor for existing systems may also be attractive, particularly where there are end-of-life systems. So there are some benefits that are more discrete. Instead of updating systems, deprecate, move to the cloud. There are also elements where new businesses may be starting. Instead of starting something up and putting something dedicated in your own environment, maybe a lot more cost effective to do that in the cloud and using a cloud provider. Resource management. We keep hearing about the availability of people in the technology world, in the security world, and certainly allows for scalability as the company grows or shrinks to buy more or less, therefore having a flex on the total cost of ownership versus it being a fixed cost element on your income statement. So there are a lot of benefits, pluses in terms of what the cloud brings, the agility it brings, the acceleration that it might bring. And again, it's really the total cost of ownership. There are also, and we'll talk about this more, but there are also promised security benefits. In other words, we get you more secure And certainly there are some components that I would say are definitely more secure, more available in terms of physical security and the location of data, perhaps resiliency, but always, as in any transaction, caveat emptor, purchaser beware, see what you're getting, see how your data is going to move, see where it's going to be held, and so on. So there are benefits, and certainly adoption has increased. But I think also companies are becoming more aware of what they're getting, what the transaction, what the contract will entail, and paying more attention to service levels, looking at SLAs and looking at SLOs and monitoring those more closely. So those are some of the benefits, and I think there could be a lot more that companies are realizing. Just highlighting a few of the things that may be relevant to our audience.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned security as one of the benefits, and I actually agree with you. When you look at the last 5-7 years, the major cloud providers have really done a much better job compared to like 7-10 years ago, right? They spent billions of dollars improving the security of the cloud infrastructure. And I would argue, I agree with you that especially for mid-sized companies or definitely smaller companies, that it's more secure to be in the cloud than just in your own data center. But how about the largest companies like Omnicom, major media companies, but also the banks, right? The banks, financial services, healthcare. Many of those companies has a pretty long, like a long process in migrating to the cloud, especially the data, right? I mean, data is the new oil, no question about that. But most sensitive data, when you talk to the top 10 banks in the US or in the world, especially in Europe, right? I mean, it's still mostly on-prem. What are the risks that we need to look at?
Yeah, I think just one point to make. My views here are mine, not the company's views. So we are a large company. A lot of our strategies are out in the open in terms of what we focused on. So that is public information. It's not confidential. So I'll share that. But there is wider adoption of the cloud, and yes, there are some concerns about security. I think actually I know that some financial institutions have made decisions to use cloud in a very limited way, particularly because of the loss of control when it comes to security. So let's focus on that first, and then go back to the what it is that is actually provided. The loss of control really pertains to: do I know that you're protecting my data, that you're not intermingling it, that the people who have access to it should be the ones having access to it in your environment, cloud provider? But also, are you protecting my data in a very secure way? There is maybe it's time to bring this point up. If you look at CrowdStrike, they've published a paper on some of the very specific risks that are being faced by cloud providers today. So I want to start with that. Go ahead.
No, it was frozen. Keep going. Sorry about that.
Oh, am I back? Sorry. I'm good.
Yeah, you're good now. You mentioned the CrowdStrike report.
So the CrowdStrike report published recently talks very specifically about the threats that cloud providers are facing, and those risks are real. There are state actors that are going after that big pool of data and that big pool of information, whether it's PII or other information. There are a couple of state actors that are named in the report, focusing on credential theft and also putting cookies in place. They're also focusing on what may be at the cloud providers' infrastructure, what may be out of date or unpatched servers and systems. So there are attacks that make banks and financial institutions more wary about whether the data and their information is protected appropriately. Now, there is that fear of losing that control, of owning the security and having visibility to it at all times. Cloud providers are becoming better at giving that information more timely, but at the same time, there is that concern. And the larger institutions that have more resources and more security focused groups that do all this work have better visibility and therefore may be a little bit more reluctant to use cloud that much more extensively, and they may be using it more strategically. So moving off from that, there are many companies that are using cloud more strategically, but also as a core strategy. So there are companies that have that I've seen, that I had worked with previously, and that I interact with colleagues and friends who have a cloud first strategy, which is, if anything new comes up, our strategy is to go to the cloud. If we have a TCO, total cost of ownership, of a particular environment that is high or is being reevaluated, instead of upgrading, we will look at the total cost of ownership of moving to cloud. So that drives the behavior in terms of moving there. What are the risks? It's not just the environment being static or what the environment that you move to. It's also how you get there. How do you move your data in a secure way? What gives you that comfort that the cloud provider stages the data appropriately and moves it over? Where is it sitting? Is it a private cloud? Is it shared? Where is your data? I have some specific experiences in my prior career where some companies were moving data with some volume of risk being accepted because they did not have full visibility from the beginning to the end. There was, if you pardon the pun, there was a cloud in between getting the data from the company to the cloud provider. So there is some of that concern. So that does have to be managed as you move. So there's that risk. Once the data is over, what are the contractual terms to protect the company's data, both from access and also resiliency? Also, where is it sitting? Are you, again, you as a company could be liable for the data sitting where it should not be. For example, European subject PII may be sitting outside of EU, and does the cloud provider have all of that taken care of in terms of protecting you as the user of that cloud? The last point, and we'll discuss this some more because I've given you a lot of points here. If you look at the responsibility matrix on some of the big cloud providers, it really is important to look at what they say belongs to you as the user and what they say belongs to them as a provider. And then look at that list and make sure that you're in agreement with that. So generally, what we're seeing is the cloud providers are putting the responsibility for data protection and data and accounts 100% on the user, not themselves. So what do your service level agreements say? Are you holding them accountable to protect your data to some degree? Granted, if you're giving a wrong person access to the data they shouldn't have, it's on you. But is that data sitting at the cloud provider protected appropriately? So those are the things to look at. And of course, if you look further down the list of who is responsible for what, physical and operational systems, operating system controls do belong more to the cloud, so that the cloud provider, so they take more ownership of that versus the data, which is really where a lot of the risk sits at. Bob?
Yeah, no, it's perfect. It's like you bring up the shared responsibility model, obviously, as security vendors working with the major cloud providers, right? And like, AWS, Azure of the world, and have to fit into that model as well, right? Not just the customers. What do you think? What are the strategies, right? I mean, it's not just about security. We talk about data. It's about the availability, the resiliency. What are the strategies that you will recommend, customers or, companies, large and mid-size, when to make sure the data is available and resilient as they start moving data to S3, AWS S3 or Azure Block of the world?
Yeah. So I think just the multiple steps here. Firstly, my recommendation is to have a strategy within the company that helps you to decide what you will move, what you won't move. Secondly, you got to make risk part of the process of moving and deciding whether to use a cloud provider. So the total cost of ownership is great. Let's move everything. Think about the risk. Who owns security? How much risk are you putting on the table and you're accepting? Yes, you could save some money by moving to the cloud provider, but if you're responsible for security and you're not handling that responsibility, the cost of ownership could be a lot higher in the case of something happening. So have a strategy, consider the risks up front. Right? What are the risks that you're accepting? How much are you taking on? How much is the cloud provider taking on? Consider regulatory risk. If you're in the healthcare business, you're outsourcing. Many hospitals are doing it. It's normal. Question is, it's PHI, who's responsible, what's your role, what's their role. Have a plan in terms of what the incident response and incident activities will be. Who owns what? Who notifies whom? If something happens, what are the steps? And who's responsible for declaring an event or an incident, and who's responsible for taking care of that, notifications and so on. That has to be a critical part, the regulatory piece. If you can afford it, consider CASBs to look at to monitor data loss and also enforce controlled access across multiple cloud providers. Decide on which cloud providers are in scope and which ones are not. You're not going to take everybody you're not going to go everywhere, although many companies are doing it because it's pretty easy to use your credit card to purchase cloud time. So we're seeing that all over many companies. You discover that you're using the cloud that you didn't even know about because somebody's paid with their credit card to spin up a quick project. It happens. Have an agreement on the location of your data. Where is your data sitting? You need to know that. You need to know if they're moving it. You need to know if the backups are sitting in a jurisdiction that they should not be sitting at. Also consider whether there is enough resiliency built into the plan, into your agreement. What happens, and this is real, and many companies are looking at this, what happens if there are power failures in Europe at the data center point? What happens to that processing capacity, capability? Does it move to another jurisdiction that it should not move to? Does it move to a jurisdiction that's in the same area where you have a power failure? And those are things to consider, and that's really more of a timely thing to think about today. Lastly, consider the service level agreements in terms of what you should be expecting from a risk reporting, the security reporting, monitoring of events, the frequency of that sharing of information, and whether it's real-time sharing of threats or potential issues, or having a cadence that's agreeable between the two, between the provider and yourself.
No, that's really great advice, Marios. How would you recommend companies to lower the cost while minimizing the risk as they go through this migration journey, right? I mean, this is a critical decision. And what kind of timeline should they expect for, let's say, for a Fortune 500 company?
So, ask me the last part again, the timeline.
Like, what kind of timeline? Should they kind of set a timeline to get the project completed? Is it a number of years, or it really depends on each company is different, or each industry is different?
Yeah, I think all companies will have their own specific timeline, Bob, in terms of what the benefits, the costs are, and the outlays of funds. I think it's important to have that as part of your strategy. Is the way I would answer that question. What is the overall strategy of the company in terms of the migration to cloud, right? Is that something that is core? Is it a protracted time frame, or is it more let's get it done quickly because we have to move, because we have a risk in terms of our inability to launch a new product, or we're at the end of life on many systems and therefore we need to accelerate? Or is it more an orderly transition that says over the next 3 years, these regions and these systems will migrate to the cloud? So I think if your question is around timing and strategy around timing, it really will depend on what the objectives and the business drivers are to move to the. Let's not forget that the business driver is always critical.
That makes perfect sense, Marios. So there are a number of frameworks out there, right, and that we can follow. Do you any specific frameworks that you can recommend? And how to
Sure. Let me highlight one thing before I talk about the frameworks. One item I hadn't focused on is many of the cloud providers are sharing SOC reports, SOC 1, SOC 2s. They're sharing ISO certifications. It's really important for the buyer of the services to look at what is covered in those SOC 1, SOC 2 reports. So the SOC reports are US based. There is the equivalent in Europe. SSAE, I think, is a nomenclature, but that covers controls around the processing or data availability or security. It's important to look at those reports from 2 perspectives or 3 perspectives. One is the audit report unqualified? In other words, is the control environment at the cloud provider working the way they say it is? Secondly, though, it's important for the buyer to look at the scope of that report. You've purchased a certain volume of cloud services, whether it's servers or processing, whatever it is. Make sure that SOC report scope covers what you are using, because it may not. Just make sure that has the case. And then thirdly, there is a section in these reports called CUEC, which is the complementary user entity controls, which basically say, okay, cloud user, we are responsible for all these controls, but these controls belong to you. And if you make a mistake, if you don't exercise them correctly, then you may have a gap. For example, only authorized users should be provided to the cloud, should be sent to the cloud provider to be provisioned. If you send the wrong person, if you send somebody who should not have access to something, that becomes problematic. So my advice is to look at the reports that you're getting, whether they are SOC reports, HIPAA, or other PCI or other certifications that cloud provider sends to you, and look at, am I in scope? Are the services that I'm consuming, are they covered? And then also make sure that whatever responsibility the cloud provider puts back on you, you've actually actioned and you have taken care of those controls, and you're not making errors and accepting more risk than you think you are. Now, in terms of the, getting back to your question, in terms of the frameworks, let me talk about ISO first, because ISO 27001 has come out with its new 2022 version of the standard for security. And although in the previous version, which was 2013, it alluded to cloud, there is much more direct requirements around the information security for use of cloud services, section 5.23 to be exact. It talks about it has a more comprehensive view when a company is using cloud, and puts a lot of responsibility on the company itself to protect its data. The first thing it looks for is what is the process that you've put in place to acquire those services? In other words, what's your contract look like? Secondly, for example, what does your contract look like? And another part which I found interesting is, what's your exit strategy? What happens if things don't work out and you need to bring things back in-house? Or if you need to move to another provider? How do you protect the data in that transmission stage? Really important. And I think very, very perceptive of the IEC to put that in there. There should be a clear delineation. Secondly, there needs to be a clear delineation of responsibility between the cloud provider and the user, the purchaser. Who owns what? Who monitors what? Who's responsible? Then they have a whole list of definitions of what are the security requirements that you're going to purchase or use from the provider. What are the roles and responsibilities? Day-to-day, provisioning of users, incident response, just some examples. Who owns which controls? What assurance are you getting from the provider? Is there some kind of SOC or other report that you're going to be relying on? What are the interfaces between your systems? How does the data get transmitted? Is sensitive data encrypted in transmission, for example? Is it stored appropriately and protected in backup format? And then, again, it highlights the incident response procedures. It says who does what. It needs to be clearly delineated. And then they have a whole section on contracting with cloud providers that talks about confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, and then managing those risks. Last point they mentioned, which I, again, also think is intuitive and good to have in that standard, is what happens if the cloud provider uses subcontractors? Whose responsibility is that? And is it disclosed to you as a consumer of that service? So if a cloud provider decides to offshore something or to use another sub-provider, is that sub-provider, that subcontractor, as secure as you expect them to be? And is that part of your contract? Is that permissible or is that not permissible? So those are the things that the ISO framework has highlighted. NIST has been around for a while, and NIST SP 800-37 talks about the framework for cloud. It talks about analyzing your cloud environment to see potential vulnerabilities. A lot of it is about what the cloud providers should be doing, and that's something that is important for the user to ask. What framework does the cloud provider use to protect itself? What are they doing from a monitoring perspective? How do they manage risks? What controls do they have in place? Which controls belong where, to the provider or to the purchaser of the services? So I think I've gone into some level of detail there, but those are some of the frameworks. Of course, there are many others, but just giving you a flavor that it's not just the end product, it's how you get there and how you manage transitions, entry and exit points, and how you manage the data throughout its whole life cycle.
No, that's very, very helpful, Marios, in terms of the strategies and the recommendations you provide to the community. We do have a couple of questions. We may need 2-3 minutes of the time. You touch on control of the data as you store the data with the cloud providers, right? How can you find out, or how can you find out where the data is located, or can you? Like, let's say, can you do you get assurance from the cloud providers that where the data is located geographically?
Yes, there's two suggestions in that. On that, firstly, you have to make some decisions as the purchaser as to where you want your data. So if you owned it, if the data was on your own systems, you would make some of those decisions. So firstly, if you're contracting, make sure that that's in the contract, that your data can only reside in a specific jurisdiction, and that if it's to be moved, you need to be notified. Secondly, if you have an existing contract and you're concerned about that, my recommendation is to ask for specific disclosure of where the data is kept, but also where the backups are kept, and also what happens in terms of the data movement in case of when the provider is doing testing of its resiliency and its backups. In other words, do they move the data somewhere else? You should also ask about the physical location of backup data if they're using that. So those are the questions I would ask. Yes, they should disclose that to you.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So we are pretty much allocated time for the audience and for you, obviously. Marios, any final thoughts you want to share with the community here?
Yeah, thank you firstly for the opportunity to have the chat. We covered a lot of ground. There are a lot of frameworks out there to use. Certainly, a lot of risks. It is important, as I've mentioned several times, to look at the life cycle of the movement to cloud, the management of the cloud, the changing of cloud providers or moving back. Now, there is that trend as well. Companies are saying, hold on, we're paying too much. We're going to do some things in-house. We're only going to do more strategic movement. But the trend is here. We're always going to have something in the cloud, whichever way it is. So it's something that we're going to live with. Choose a framework that you're going to manage your environment with. It gives you guidance. It gives you a way to make sure that you cover all elements. And then hold your cloud provider accountable. Make sure that you contractually have that ability to the question that was asked. Where is the data? Where is it? Is it sitting somewhere it shouldn't? And then what's our notification if something happens? Can we know timely enough so we can protect our customers, our people whose data may be sitting at the cloud? So those are the things that I would end off with, and just caveat emptor, purchaser beware. Look at what you're buying. Make sure you know what you own, what you're responsible for, and keep monitoring it. Keep asking those questions, and then checking the metrics and the SLA feedback that you're getting.
Great. Hey, thank you very much, Marios, for your time and very valuable insights and sharing with us your really decades of experience in risk management and security as well. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you very soon. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.